Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name is Enrique Desmanarias. I am the Marx Chair of Western Hemisphere Affairs and professor at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College. Our session today is being recorded. Cocaine, like other commodities, exists on a value chain that runs from fields around the Andes Mountains, where it is produced, to consumers in large and small cities around the world. At each stage of this value chain, cocaine and governments' responses to it affect how people and communities live and seek to survive. The cocaine trade is governed by its own internal logic that diverges from the dominant economic models, but is often deeply implicated in local, normatively regulated exchanges. Cocaine starts as a coca leaf, a crop that has been cultivated and consumed by indigenous people in the Andes for well over 4,000 years. Today, close to 250,000 peasants cultivate the leaf in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia in marginal areas characterized by minimal state presence, limited infrastructure, and high rates of poverty. In addition, thousands of impoverished young men and increasingly women labor in the process of process and traffic small quantities of cocaine paste, a first step in refining pure cocaine. From the coca fields, the drug is processed and then trafficked to consumer markets, with much of the product first passing through Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, and Brazil, Europe, and Asia, where the retail markets for garner higher prices have grown to become important consumer markets, and this has led to the development of new trafficking routes via Brazil, Venezuela, and West Africa. There's been a significant growth of drug use in South America, particularly in Brazil, which now represents the second largest national drug consumer market after the United States, emblematic of cocaine's shift south, as Paul Gutenberg has put it. Transshipment and smuggling markets tend to have a few large market participants who employ a modest number of workers at different skill levels. The nature of the risk in these areas contributes to efforts to establish dominance over a market, either through an agreement among a few powerful market participants or through outright dominance by a single participant, at times leading to atrocities. The substantial earnings coupled with relatively small number of market participants leads to significant capital accumulation that can enable illicit entrepreneurs to start or take over illicit businesses. In sites of consumption, large retail markets tend to produce fragmented and competing structures that lead to ongoing low-grade conflict, subject to extensive police oversight. Dealers and populations that live in the areas where these activities occur suffer from heavy-handed state actions. Disputes about this trade are resolved among individuals who are involved in or have been involved in the trade. Local income from these activities provides modest support for dealers and their families. There is a clear relationship between the expansion of unfettered free markets and the participation in the drug trade. Contemporary economic policies have led to increasing inequality, insecurity, and a general deterioration of the quality of life for the poor and working class in Latin America. With few other options for survival, these people are easy recruits into the drug trade. The cocaine trade integrates marginalized territories that have been abandoned by states into global markets and acts as a driver of development. And yet, governments tend to focus on the criminal aspects of the drug trade rather than the redistributive policies of the poverty that drives it. The international community, led by the United States, prioritizes drug eradication and addiction actions in producer and transit areas and retail areas, imposing disproportionate costs on countries and places and neighborhoods that are on the front line of both the domestic and the international drug war. To develop alternatives to the current drug war status quo, we first need to understand how cocaine fits into this broader supply chain. This roundtable emerges from the recently published edited volume that was edited by Thomas Grisapi and I. Look at that, cocaine. And it includes scholars who have studied production, shipment, and retail sale of cocaine. We have with us three of them. We have presenting on the panel three of them here today. First is Philippe Bourgoy. He is a professor of anthropology and social medicine in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California at Los Angeles. Professor Bourgoy has conducted participant observation ethnographic field work since the 1980s in Central America and across U.S. inner city neighborhoods. including East Harlem, New York, and Philadelphia. He is currently conducting research on shifting narcotic markets in Tijuana, Mexico, San Diego, and Los Angeles. He is best known for ethnographies. His ethnographies In Search of Respect, Selling Crack in El Barrio, Cambridge, 1995, and Righteous Dope Fiend, University of California, 2009. He is a proponent of public anthropology, focusing on the interface between substance use disorders, social inequality, the war on drugs, violence, mass incarceration, and racism. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2018 and is currently working on a co-authored manuscript, Cornered, for Princeton University Press, analyzing police violence and the carceral and psychiatric mismanagement of US urban poverty in Philadelphia. Thomas Grisafi is an associate professor of geography at the University of Reading in the United Kingdom and a visiting professor at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. Dr. Grisafi is trained as an anthropologist and works on topics including coca and cocaine production, peasant unions, alternative development, and democracy. He is the author of Coca Yes, Cocaine No, How Bolivia's Coca Growers Reshaped Democracy with Duke University Press, and is co-editor with me of Cocaine from Coca Fields to City Streets, also with Duke University Press. He is the principal investigator on a project entitled Drug Crops Development in the Andes, which is supported by the Global Challenges Research Fund and a co-investigator on the European Research Council funded project Anthropologies of Extortion. Taniele Hui is professor of anthropology at the University of Campinas in Brazil. Dr. Hui is a professor in the Department of Anthropology there, where she is coordinator of the Urban Studies concentration of the Doctorate in Social Sciences. She received her doctorate from the same university in 2012. She is the author of Nas Tramas do Crack, Etnografia da Abjeção. This project received the prize for best thesis from the Coordenação de Aperfeiçoamento de Pessoal Nível Superior, the Brazilian government agency that oversees post-secondary education, in 2013, and an honorable mention from the Society for Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology Book Prize in 2015. She is co-editor of Novas Faces da Vida nas Ruas, which was a finalist for the 2017 Jabuti Prize, one of Brazil's leading literary awards. Her research focuses on ethnography of at-risk populations and liminal situations, producing intersectional research about poverty, vulnerability, and urban marginality. Among her empirical focuses are the political interfaces between streets, drugs, urban peripheries, social assistance programs, public health, and penal settings, such as prisons and therapeutic communities. Currently, she is researching the effects of COVID-19 on vulnerable populations. She is a member of the Human Rights Commission of the Brazilian Anthropology Association. I would be remiss if I did not mention that our edited volume included other contributors, some of whom are present in the audience today, including Paul Gutenberg, Robert Gay, Cyrus Visser, Autumn Zellers-Leon, Anthony Fontes, Fernando Corban-Masson, Annette Idler, Laurie Kane Hart, Fernando Montero, George Carandinos, and Dennis Rogers. Our panel today will begin with about 45 minutes of questions that I will ask the members of the roundtable, and then we will open it up to questions from the floor, which you can submit through the chat box. So my first question, I'd like to start out with Thomas. Please describe the coca trade and how it operates at the site where you conducted your research.
Great, thank you, Desmond, and thank you to everyone for coming along, and particularly our co-authors for this book. Thank you. So I do my research in Bolivia in a region called the Chapare, which is a coca cultivating zone. So basically, this is the lowest rung of the cocaine commodity chain. And the main activities that take place there, which I discuss in my chapter, are cultivating, drying, and commercializing coca leaf, and then also processing that coca leaf into cocaine paste, which is a first step in making refined cocaine. And that kind of step from coca leaf into refined cocaine it takes place in artisanal workshops close to coca fields. So it's a very kind of low-end manufacturing. You just need gasoline, some baking soda, sulfuric acid, and you can make cocaine. So what's interesting about this stage of the cocaine trade, as opposed to the others that you'll hear about today, is that there's very widespread involvement, which involves most of the population, either directly or indirectly. And what this means is that because most people are in some way connected to the cocaine trade, that drug trade, it's not stigmatized, nor is it seen as socially disruptive. It's just a fairly mundane aspect of everyday life in a place where it's hard to sort of make a buck from pretty much anything else. For coca growers, coca cultivation, well, so for sort of peasant farmers, coca cultivation and cocaine paste production is a rational choice. And for many, it's one of the few opportunities to allow some level of social mobility. The earnings generated by the coca leaf trade and sort of base level cocaine production and trafficking helps to stabilize families' livelihoods. It keeps a greater portion of the population into rural areas, and it can support some existing small businesses. Later on, I'll discuss more about how it's organized internally, the cocaine trade. But for now, I think that's just as an introduction. That's me.
So now I'd like to ask the same question of Tanieli. Please describe the cocaine/coca trade and how it operates at the sites where you have conducted your research.
Nice. First of all, many thanks, Desmond, for this invitation and the opportunity to be here with Thomas and Felipe. It's really good and important for me to participate at this moment. And I am sure that this book grows as a necessary reference for our fields of study. Well, I've studied crack consumption in Brazil for more than 10 years. And as Paul Gothenberg is here, observes in the initial chapter of this book, and Philip described in Search of Respect, crack use in Brazil repeated what happened in the US over the years. A cycle of oversupply, low prices, racialization, and the associated large-scale public health phenomenon. Specifically for this book, I focus on how drug commands, I can say that, regulate the mobility and presence of crack users in Brazilian cities, São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. And in a comparative way, my chapter describes two scenes of crack consumption. And my point is that the territorial patterns of drug consumption are very different in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro because of the different dynamics of the drug trade in both sides. São Paulo has the most visible crack land of the country in a very attractive area of the city, on the streets downtown, and is widely commented on the media, while in Rio de Janeiro, drug use is less visible, restricted inside the favelas. I, for example, studied a restricted part of the Maré favela complex. For this study, I've employed both historical and ethnographic methodologies. So I provide an overview of this local crack market and how they are morally regulated, how the decisions made by criminal trade produce specific territorial arrangements for the consumers, how criminal organizations promote norms that impact on the everyday life of residents of the territory that they manage, and some, how the agents of the drug trade evaluate, engage with, and govern users and territories. So I studied two different urban and criminal histories, two possible commercial dynamics, and thus two different ways that crack consumption takes roots and defines territory. Both cases of studies reveal that the illegal drug trade produces and regulates user scenes in the city, but not in the same way. Finally, I would like to say that this chapter contributes with an observation of Desmond and Thomas in the introduction of this book about the limited attention paid to the complete drug commodity chain and how its commodity chain moves from production to consumption. My focus is on the moral economies of the local crack commerce, considering its effects on the sociability and spaces of consumption. Thank you.
And now I'd like to put the same question to Philippe. Philippe, you're on mute.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. It wasn't responding. First, a shout out to my co-authors who are in the audience. We did this research as an ethnographic team and write together. George Karandinos, he's an MD PhD currently doing his residency at Mass General in Boston. Fernando Montero, a postdoc at Columbia from Costa Rica originally, and Lori Kane Hart, my partner and wife, who's also a professor at UCLA. And we were at the end point of the commodity chain that Thomas Grisafi opened up with. So we were the Philadelphia open air drug markets are one of the largest in the United States and one of the most efficiently organized, and according to the DEA, have the cheapest and most potent of the heroin and cocaine that's distributed in the United States. It's a remarkable phenomenon, and it's a worst case scenario of dysfunctional policy. The neighborhood is the traditional industrial heartland of actually, it was actually, Philadelphia is the quintessential industrial Rust Belt city of the United States. So it's the classic cause, one could argue, of the entire tragedy of the multi-billion-dollar narcotics economy, and especially the Americas' relationship to it, what's destroyed daily life all across the Americas and in the hemisphere. So it's about a 200 square block neighborhood of huge abandoned factories, essentially, with small row homes surrounding the factories. That was built, starting in the 1860s or so, when during Philadelphia's glorious years. Philadelphia's been in decline, has been losing population and jobs ever since the 1950s, since the end of the Korean War, and that's when the various drug economies started coming in with a vengeance, with cocaine arriving as it did in other parts of the country in the 1980s when the prices dropped precipitously. And it became a center for crack distribution and powder cocaine. And it is known as one of the cities with the most consistently well-supplied cocaine markets. Primarily because of its relationship to Puerto Rico. It's a magnet city for poor Puerto Ricans from the countryside who are expelled by joblessness, by the destruction of the agricultural economy in Puerto Rico because of its dysfunctional colonial economy. Puerto Rico is a formal colony of the United States. Puerto Ricans are unable to find jobs and feed themselves and survive in their own country. So over half have been forced to migrate to the United States. And a large proportion of that population gets trapped in the formal industrial zones of large Rust Belt cities on the East Coast, Philadelphia being one of the classic ones, like I was saying, but New York being the quintessential Puerto Rican migration point initially. And so that relationship, drug markets follow relationships of trust. And in the United States, where racism is so formidably powerful, they follow racialized lines that make them more efficient and also raise trust levels between all the participants. So the drugs are sold on almost every other corner for about 200 square blocks in this industrial area, and it's a hub for transportation to the rest of the city and the region. The highways go through there, the trains go through there, and the subway, the Philadelphia subway goes through there. So it's very easy for outsiders to come in, and it essentially serves as the four-state distribution point, the mid-Atlantic four-state distribution point. It serves New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, with, as I've been saying, the most potent and least expensive and very efficiently 24/7 open markets. So these markets are open all night long, all day long, are very efficiently run. And the majority of the clients are migrating in on a daily basis to purchase. And as a matter of fact, with COVID lockdowns, when they locked down the subway in Philadelphia, the neighborhood went completely inactive. It was a disaster. There was no money on the streets. Everything fell apart. It was a remarkable sight to see that dependence on the outside economy.
Thank you, Philippe. So the next question, and I'd like to start this question with Tanieli. What are the most substantial problems people living in the areas you've researched face in general and as related to the cocaine trade in the area?
Well, the contemporary Latin American city is characterized by high levels of unemployment, decline opportunity, and social exclusion. The societies are extremely unequal, sexist, and racist. And in Brazil, the process of democratization during the 80s and 90s was concomitant with the increase of violence, crime, and insecurity. The most prominent actors in this new panorama of urban violence are the gangs and drug gangs that dispute between them and with the state, the governor of urban territories. So, on the one hand, slums and poor neighborhoods have become even more precarious, regulated by criminal gangs, and cut off from the rest of the city. While the rich, they live protected by high walls, electrified fences, bulletproof glass, and private security. This organization of urban space has profound implications for citizenship and democracy, and dramatic consequences until nowadays with the arrival of Bolsonaro to power. But this chapter tells a specific story. Here we see urban zoning as ongoing process that involves constant negotiation between various actors. The population of crack users moves around, and the kind of decisions drug traffickers make then, which are rooted in deeper social logics about protecting their communities, businesses, and relationships, and everything reconfigure spaces in Brazilian cities. Besides this general analysis, the point that I am interested is to show the local implications and how the biggest city in Brazil developed a different urban criminal history. The dispute for cocaine trade in the 80s made the city of Rio de Janeiro face a particular war. This is the name of a famous documentary in Brazil, and the emergence of at least 3 commands and recently military forces. In turn, in São Paulo, this same process contributed to the monopoly of the first command of the capital, PCC. These situations reflect different perceptions about the violence in the city, different connections between illegal market and violence, and distant forms to organize the trade of drugs and different negotiations with the police. Finally, I have to say that I worked with the most precarious people of this chain, people that are homeless, unemployable, and in safe security conditions, that use drugs in a prejudicial way from themselves, most of them in constant displacement, most of them blacks, most of them know the prison. I intend to follow the life of them and the territories they are allowed to occupy. And I hope that from this marginal perspective, I can, I can come light to Brazilian conflict.
So I'd like to turn the same question over to Philippe and ask about the life experience in particular as affected by cocaine of the people that you've been researching in Philadelphia.
So in very concrete terms, the firearm violence rate in this neighborhood is the highest in the entire city of Philadelphia. And tragically, Philadelphia is consistently either the most violent or in the top few of the most violent of the 10 largest cities in the United States. And so the specific, we actually collaborated with a hotshot epidemiologist, Joe Friedman, an MD, PhD student at UCLA, and calculated that of the majority Puerto Rican census tracts, 62 of every 100,000 people get shot. Among whites in the rest of Philadelphia, and including whites in this neighborhood, 6 per 100,000. It's just an extraordinary tenfold higher chance of getting killed in this neighborhood. So that's the sort of immediate, deadly, most visible and sort of most spectacular, not the most visible, the most spectacular. You hear gunshots exploding, relatively regularly, not necessarily every day, but you're not at all surprised every day and night. As a matter of fact, on the last visit we made, Lori Hart and I went this summer. A young boy was shot right in front of us as we were chit-chatting with neighbors, checking how people had survived COVID and how things were. The other basic impact is how difficult it makes to raise a child in the neighborhood, because there's very few local businesses that give kids jobs after school. It's simply an economic wasteland, and it looks like a wasteland. And there's been no attempt by the city, no functional attempt by the city to create any kind of investment in the local community. So as a result, it becomes a common sense to get a part-time job in the local economy. And when you're stuck the whole summer, unable to find a job, you start getting criticized for being lazy if you don't go into the economy. It's really a tragic, commonsensical situation. While people, while parents will be opposed to it, will not want it to happen, it has this tremendous economic logic. On our particular block, we calculated that about on a typical decent day when the police don't raid too much, $14,000 would exchange hand on this extraordinarily poor block. So that's a huge amount of money to attract, basically energetic youth into a very destructive role of chronic incarceration, and then the occupational injuries of addiction and firearm violence. So that's the tragedy is basically the collateral negative effects of an artificially profitable economy that's driven by addiction logics, as opposed to as opposed to sort of natural irrelevant laws of a harmless consumption product. It's not an elastic demand, so to speak. It's a demand that people are desperate for.
Thank you, Philippe. And now I'd like to turn the same question over to Thomas. What is the experience of the population in the areas you research, and how is it affected by the cocaine trade?
Yeah, thanks, Desmond. So I think, just to tell you a little bit more about the case study that I look at. So it's at the foothills of the Andes, and it's a dense tropical forest, right? This is a agricultural colonization zone where people moved in the 50s and 60s, in part as a result of US-backed infrastructure programs, which Paul Gutenberg has recently published a book about across the Americas. And they moved there beginning in the 1560s, but it really stepped up in the 80s. And that was because of the expansion of the cocaine market, so generating opportunities to make money, but also because it coincided with a time when Bolivia followed through with quite severe neoliberal economic reforms that put people who worked in nationally owned enterprises, specifically the mines, out of work. So they became sort of dispossessed, and another sort of, I think it was 27,000 miners and their families, and then about another sort of 40,000 state workers in different kinds of enterprises. And they really had nowhere to turn to. So a lot of them in that context turned to the cocaine economy. So in a way, that story of migration to the region and depending on the illicit economy mirrors the story that Daniele and Felipe are telling as well. And these regions have never been properly integrated into the state. They often lack, well, many parts of the Chapare that I study in Bolivia, that lack roads, lacks bridges, lack schools, lack healthcare centers. That's all been improved in the past 15 years with the movement towards socialism government of Evo Morales, but many places are still very, very marginal, and still basically this, the big challenge they face is that you can't actually make ends meet cultivating legal crops. And this is a familiar story in coca growing regions of Peru and of Colombia as well. So basically the problem is if you live in a context with very limited road network and bridges, it's just very expensive and inefficient, and you own 5 hectares of land. You can't realistically compete on international markets selling bananas or chocolate or coffee and things. And things like coffee are obviously quite susceptible to pests. And even just local markets are just saturated, and the price of crops like oranges or bananas is just very, very low. And so even in the 2012 census, after they've had this kind of left-wing government that was kind of trying to invest heavily in the Chapare region, already by that point, by 6 years, the 2012 census indicates that 50% of the population live in moderate poverty, 20% are classified as destitute, and 75% have unmet basic needs, so things like access to sanitation, running water, and so on. So the big challenge they have then is like, well, how do you survive? And in that way, it's kind of similar to what Daniele and Felipe are suggesting. You're kind of dependent on the legal economies. It's one way that coca production kind of integrates this region into global markets, and it's the only thing that really achieves that. But what's quite interesting is that the results of this illicit economy are very different. So I've already told you that there's a very widespread participation in the drugs trade at this level. So it's not just a few people on a city block or whatever. It's I'm talking about a region which is the size of New Hampshire, and with a population of around 200,000 people. And so in contrast to other stages along cocaine's supply chain, the cocaine trade doesn't necessarily generate significant challenges at the local level. Actually, it kind of generates just lots of opportunities. So while, just to be clear, there are high levels of violence in the Chapare when it comes to things like domestic violence, or they enact forms of community justice, which can be quite violent, right? So if someone is stealing things in your village, then the retribution will be severe. But levels of violence associated directly with the drug trade itself are very, very low. And there's many reasons why that's the case, and I'll come back to those later in response to further questions from Desmond. Revenues are distributed between community members, so there's kind of leveling mechanisms. So if you get rich on the back of cocaine, you're expected to become a community sponsor and reinvest into your community. And there are also very low levels of drug use in these communities. So while people chew coca leaf, and it's an important element of sort of Quechua indigenous culture of sharing, well, just Bolivian national culture, actually, I should say, of sharing the coca leaf, eating it, chewing it, drinking it as a tea, using it as part of rituals. So they do that, and while they would have cocaine-based paste available to smoke should they want to, it's actually very uncommon. So they're my sort of two things is, this sort of the broader picture, which is kind of somehow familiar to the stories, but the outcomes are quite different. Although, just to add one minor parenthesis there, is that since the kind of 2010s onwards, potentially, and I'm not saying this is a causal factor, but potentially could be linked, I suppose, to the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, being kicked out of Bolivia in 2008. What we're seeing is an expansion of cocaine refining. So that's where you take the cocaine-based paste, which is made in these artisanal workshops I've already told you about, which are then transported to more capital-intensive refineries, and these refineries cost between $150,000 to $300,000 to establish. And when you get that concentration of capital, that's when you start to see high levels of violence done by armed guards. And if anyone's going to step on the hose, then there is a problem. But I'll come back to that, and that's me for now. Thank you.
So, so I wanted to build on some of the comments that Tom was just making about norms and exchanges within these communities, and ask how the cocaine trade affects and is affected by the norms in the communities where it operates. And I wanted to put this question to Philippe first, because the notion of the relationship between norms and the cocaine trade was so distinct in his first book, In Search of Respect.
So the amazing thing about the drug market in Philadelphia, and actually essentially the entire, tragically, the entire coastal, or basically the diaspora cities of U.S. colonial diaspora cities that have poor inner cities, where Puerto Ricans have been confined looking for jobs, and then because of American racism, obliged to live there in jobs that disappeared. That the generally the cheapest and most expensive, the cheapest and most potent drug markets are concentrated in those neighborhoods. It's actually basically a unique phenomenon of Puerto Ricans not participating in the same kind of racism that the U.S. has. The skin tone racism of the United States operates very differently in the United States, with much Puerto Ricans are truly a rainbow community, a rainbow people in that sense. There's much more intermarriage rates across people of different, skin color. And so the categories of white, black, Latinx, indigenous, and so forth are don't operate, and that makes the Puerto Rican neighborhood accessible to every single ethnicity, to the people with drug habits from every single ethnicity, where they can come in and actually, be welcome. In a sense, not be particularly noticed. Philadelphia is a tremendous, like many U.S. cities, but especially Philadelphia is a tremendously segregated. It's one of what they call hyper-segregated cities of the United States. It's a traditional black-white. It's a black-white segregation, and the Puerto Rican neighborhood is exactly between, an all segregated white neighborhood and an all segregated black neighborhood. And it's this sort of multi-skin toned Puerto Rican neighborhood that, allows whites and blacks to come in and tolerates the dysfunction of being overrun by addicts from the rest of the city, from the 4 states surrounding. It's interesting to see when we actually systematically started talking to street customers about their experiences. Why did they choose to come to the Puerto Rican community? And it was very straightforward. It was, you don't get mugged, you don't get beaten, you don't get shouted out. You don't get chased by someone with a baseball bat to leave the neighborhood. People are polite to you, friendly to you. And it's counterintuitive to some extent because you hear all the violence and because the nature of drug economies is to produce, lots of mugging, lots of opportunistic petty crime. But there is also, so there's that unique phenomenon of the Puerto Rican relationship to the United States. And not that Puerto Rico isn't internally racist, according to skin color. It's just not monolithically racist the way the United States is. There's many more inconsistencies to it. So the structure of the markets rely on charismatic charismatic drug bosses, and the levels of violence are high, and the drug bosses emerge as someone who can claim to reduce the violence by creating order. Now their order is based on violence, but it operates in this complex moral economy of legitimacy that the drug bosses are eternally scared of being informed on by their neighbors, right? That's the Achilles heel of anyone selling drugs, is that a neighbor is going to identify you to the police. The police are so alienated from the community. They're so lazy and hostile to it, and brutal to the neighborhood, that they don't make any effort to develop relationships to build any kind of contact with local residents. They basically hate the residents. The Philadelphia police are notoriously corrupt. They're notoriously violent, and they're completely unaccountable. It's one of the, there's many pathetic big city police forces in the United States, but Philadelphia really takes the case. It's constantly under federal court orders, and they have absolutely no effect in changing the behavior of the police. The union arbitrators of the police are able to reimpose. Anyone that a police commissioner tries to fire, the arbitrator reverses the ruling. It's really quite an outrageous situation. So as a result, the drug boss emerges as someone who offers or pretends to offer stability to the neighborhood. Relative to the mayhem of when you have competing sellers amongst each other fighting for control of the neighborhood. So that's that ambiguous moral economy that is so crucial, and then becomes very seductive to basically youth who admire the charisma of the guy who is usually it's a guy, occasionally it's a woman, who draws their guns faster than anyone else. And when people come to them unable to pay their gas bill, their electric bill, their heating bill, they'll make a big show of helping them out. They throw block parties. They buy little plastic swimming pools in the summer and so forth.
So I'd like to turn this question over to Tanyeli now, in particular because her chapter was about the management of crack consuming populations by gangs within these neighborhoods, often dictated at least somewhat by local norms in the communities where the drugs were being sold.
Yes, and my answer is ethnographic, but and for São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro is different also. So I will tell about. The arrival of crack helped to change the scale and shape of drug trafficking in São Paulo. Crack was a stabilizing element on a drug market still being consolidated. which means that the sale of crack deepened the social conflicts inside the slums in São Paulo. It was during this period in Brazil we call noia. I think it's like dunking, in the US. Noia emerged in popular discourse as a person who is unable to follow community rules. Crack users were accused of disturbing the flow of the everyday life, accruing large debts, stealing from community members. So a lot of cracks stand in the history, and during the 90s, a lot of crack users were killed. And these deaths have to be understood in the context of intense conflict between police, as police group, gangs, and dealers for monopoly control of the territory. But of the course of 2-3 decades, the PCC, the first command of the capital, consolidated power and changing the organization of the drug market and the ways gang managed problematic crack users. After 2010, the peripheries of São Paulo had become far safer as a result of the hegemony of the PCC. There are a lot of bibliographies saying this, which promoted a more ordered approach to drug sale. The PCC banned crack in prisons, and its members strictly managed crack around the metropolitan area. So, lacking an serious competition, the PCC was able to build norms that offered poor residential neighborhoods some protection against problematic drug users. Drug traffickers are motivated to minimize conflicts and their distribution points to avoid police attention and keep positive relations with neighborhoods. In sum, they have a respect for the communities where they live and work. And in this sense, crack commerce forms part of an alternative moral economy that prioritizes good relations between criminal actors and local residents. But in Rio de Janeiro, things are a bit different because there are 3 commands, there are militias, so they disputed the cocaine trade since the 80s, and the crack just arrived in Rio de Janeiro in 2000. An anthropologist here in Brazil, Antônio Rafael Barbosa, called this as the Rio de Janeiro mystery, because crack is delayed. The reason for this delay is due to a series of moral and economic considerations on the part of the drug traffickers. Criminal factions thought that drug would destroy their relations and the neighborhood, the relationships of neighborhoods. These are moral perceptions that, over the course of 2000s, came into conflict with the increasingly high capital turnover generated by this trade. So there is a delicate moral and monetary calculation, and this is important to understand these different situations of crack consumption scenes in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. But also in São Paulo, crack consumption rapidly transformed the dynamics of the traffic in Rio de Janeiro. So generating a new structure for drug management and sales, but also daily effort by the traffickers themselves to organize the spaces under their influence. I think how the drug trade, for me, what is important is how the drug trade is not simply driven by crude economic consideration, but if crack sales generate a great deal of profit, it also is balanced by moral considerations. Criminal organizations carefully manage problematic drug users and prioritize the relations with neighborhoods and agents of the state. Moreover, the decisions that criminal organizations make regarding the distribution of drugs, including the kind of drugs they are prepared to market and to whom, and have implications not just for the areas where they hold sway, but for the city as a whole.
Thank you, Tanya. And now I'd like to ask Thomas about what role the government plays in the coca/cocaine trade in Bolivia.
Thanks, Desmond. Well, so there's a really interesting story to be told about Bolivia because, of course, in Bolivia, the coca growers since 2006, in effect, kind of were the government. So to tell that story, you just sort of need to take a step back in time. To the sort of the back to the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, with sort of US assistance, the government really hit coca growers very, very hard. It was, war on drugs, forced eradication, and use of the military against poor peasants. Now, the coca growers who live in the Chapare are organized into peasant unions, and they're highly organized, and they became one of the most sort of important social forces in the country. And in part, the reason why they became so prominent and so powerful was in part because of the way they were struggling against this kind of US-backed war on drugs. But what's interesting is right back in the sort of mid-90s, the Cocos established their own political party, which eventually became known as the Movement Towards Socialism, and it very quickly gained a national profile. And in 2006, the Movement Towards Socialism became the governing party of Bolivia, making Evo Morales the president, and he himself was a coca grower from the Chapare, so he was a union leader of the coca growers, and he then became president. And during his tenure from 2006 till 2019, the MAS is still in power, but no longer with Evo Morales. During his tenure, he maintained very close links to the Chapare. So while I was conducting ethnographic fieldwork in the Chapare, on and off for the past 15 years, I would meet Evo Morales kind of every couple of weeks because he was literally all there all the time. So there's this very close relationship between the coca growers and the government. And there are sort of, I suppose, there are competing views about what role the government may or may not play in the drugs trade. And I don't have the data to be able to actually maybe say anything concrete about that. Apart from on some interviews. But the thing I want just to tell you very quickly about is kind of Morales's approach to sort of controlling coca and controlling drugs. So one of the things that they did is they advanced this radical policy that basically legalized coca leaf. And this has been widely considered to be a step in the right direction, harm reduction, ceased violence of the drug war, and actually brought down coca cultivation. So very positive policies, but it's also maintained a very kind of hardline approach to cocaine trafficking. So it's not actually, while it's progressive on coca, it's not progressive on cocaine trafficking. And this has led to sort of lots of criticism from the outside about, the kind of, people on the right kind of look at Morales and they often denounce the Chapare as this kind of like massive drug cartel, but these are just ridiculous kind of commentaries really. And people on the left are very kind of, maybe don't want to recognize necessarily the connection between coca and cocaine. So but on a local level, at least, when it comes to government involvement directly in trafficking of cocaine, anecdotal reports I received was that to some extent the police were sort of turning blind eyes, and it was there was a bit of a porous border there. But that's all I'd say about that without saying too much.
And now I'd like to turn this question to Philippe and ask him how the state's response to drugs operates in the United States. The cocaine operates in the neighborhood he works in Philadelphia.
Yeah, actually, I want to even take a step back from that to just talk about the entire phenomenon of the globalized multi-billion-dollar cocaine trade. The reason that exists is because of dysfunctional U.S. policy, and it's very easy to identify the moment, why, and what happened. In the 1960s and 70s, the primary drug coming in from Colombia was marijuana, right? Nixon declared the war on drugs, and they came after marijuana with a vengeance. And marijuana is a difficult drug to smuggle. It's smelly, it's large, it's not that valuable per volume, and per trouble of transporting it. So it's hard to hide and so forth. So the smugglers who had been airlifting marijuana into the United States switched basically, very logically, to marketing powder cocaine. And when you look at the wholesale DEA, U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration statistics, the kilo price of heroin dropped more than tenfold during the period right in the 1980s, when Reagan intensified the repressive war on drugs, and that logic created super cheap powder cocaine that then erupted into crack. But at the local level, what you have is a demoralized, racist, and pettily corrupt police force, policing as outsiders this neighborhood. They hate the people they police. They don't like their bosses. They want to go home. They want to eat a donut in their car and stay warm. And so they pursue the logics of how to make the most overtime, and most of them double their income every single year, up to over $100,000 a year, through these practices by focusing on arresting the addicts, the customers who are physically dependent on the drug, who are emotionally dependent on the drug, and the lowest hand-to-hand seller who's so visible and vulnerable on the street. And arresting retail sellers and users is like sweeping sunshine off the sidewalk. It's a completely irrelevant act. What it does for the police is it's extremely profitable. They get to double their salaries by having to go to court and getting overtime. It's so pathetic, that the strategy of the police, and so corrupt, that the first thing that the police commissioner did, a police commissioner who was supposed to be a reformist police commissioner, Ramsey Clark, did, was he issued a directive that only one police officer was allowed to be listed as a witness in trials, because what the police teams were doing, they would list 3 or 4 other police officers, all their buddies, so that they too would have to go to court and rack up overtime for sitting in court uselessly. It's a truly idiotic dynamic, and extraordinarily brutal to the people that are affected by it, because it creates this trampoline of a cycle of being constantly arrested for petty possession of $10 worth of drugs, or just possession or sales of minuscule amounts of drugs, and once you get half a dozen of those, 4 of those arrests, basically you plea bargain and you get 2 to 4 years. That was basically the pattern. So people were constantly getting cycled through on these 2 to 4 year prison sentences that then get jacked up. They call you a predicate felon, and they get doubled the next time. So it truly destroys a teenager's life when they go in not recognizing the levels of risk and thinking that it's so easy to make some crazy money, easy money, and there's no other options to be able to buy a pair of sneakers. There's no other part-time legal jobs, and then the next thing they know, they're seduced by it and cycling in and out of jail. So the other extraordinary dynamic of the police is one of the things that the easiest way to do this whole process is to racially profile. That when you have no relationship to the neighborhood, when you don't talk to people, when you have no idea of what the drug of who the high level sellers are, who the suppliers are, or anything about really the drug trade. You simply they basically enforce any violation of apartheid. Anytime they see a white, someone who looks white talking to someone who looks Latinx, that's what causes them to pay attention to it and to search search or arrest, because any communication across racial lines is considered a drug sale, because they know that the U.S. is so racist, and there is very little communication across ethnicities, and so they use this very simple way of this simple fact of U.S. racism, and then make it into a really formal. It's no longer de facto apartheid. It's actually an enforcement of segregation. And we actually experimented with this systematically as a natural experiment as a team, because Fernando Montero is Latino, right? And the rest of us are white. And when Fernando would walk around on his own, the police wouldn't particularly notice him. They never stopped him at random or did anything with him. And when we would walk with Fernando, that's when then we would all be arrested, with Fernando being accused of being the seller and us being accused, the whites being accused of being the customers. It's really a pathetically, obvious and blatantly racist way of enforcing, and extremely efficient from the police's point of view. They don't have to work hard. They can get tons of overtime, and they never stop the problem. There's never an end to the problem. You're never going to make a dent in any kind of limit to the supply of drugs by arresting the customers and the sellers. So there's an irony to it. It reproduces itself in its dysfunction.
We're running a little bit tight on time. I wanted to remind everybody, if they have any questions, to put it in the chat box. And I'm going to go through one last round of questions, and being mindful of the time, ask you if you can respond relatively briefly to this question, which is, in light of what we just talked about, right, these serial problems and challenges both faced by populations and created by existing drug control policy, what do you see as solutions to these challenges facing these different communities? And I'm going to start with Thomas and then move up the supply chain through Daniele and Philippe. But just briefly, thank you.
So challenges and policies?
Oh, how do you reforms to address these challenges?
So I think Bolivia actually provides a really great roadmap for other sort of drug crop producing nations with its harm reduction policies, sort of legalizing cultivation and not decriminalizing cultivation and not kind of making criminals of peasants, pumping development assistance to cocoa growing regions, and sort of increasing participation. So in Bolivia, grassroots movements play a real fundamental role in designing and implementing the kind of development they want. So I think there's lots of ideas coming out of Bolivia of a different way to sort of move people beyond drug crops. And I've been working on a project on that with colleagues in Peru, Maritza Paredes, Alvaro Pastor, in Bolivia, Kathy Lederber and Linda Farthing, and also with Sydney Silverstein, who's on the call here. And we've got a paper in World Development, which tries to see what can be learned from Bolivia and applied to other contexts, specifically Peru, but also Colombia. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Daniele?
Well, I will start. I have to agree with Felipe. Here in Brazil, the problems are the prisons, a lot of crack users and gangs, and 1/3 of the adult Brazilian population incarcerated is due to drugs law. And the other problem is about the police incursions on slums in Rio de Janeiro, and what is absurd during the pandemic of COVID, the police incursions was prohibited by federal court, and during this period, the most the most biggest slaughter in Brazil occurred, and 28 people were killed in Jacarezinho favela. But about solutions, I have to say that a lot of things were trying here in Brazil, a lot of programs about army reduction, and these programs are being dismantled by the federal governments and local governments. So a lot of, I think a lot of things was created and a lot of things was dismantled. And the other thing that is important to say is that the anti-prohibitionist movement is very strong in Brazil, but now this movement have been actualized by Black movements that claim for a new drug policies with historic reparation. So through the reconnaissance of the damage of the drug war, the criminal responsibility of state agents, and the amnesty to the people incarcerated because the drug law. So I reinforce this perspective because that if the prohibitionist paradigm is operating is because their negative consequences are not the same in the Brazilian society. And this demand doesn't appear as urgent because upper class are not affected with the prohibition. And I think one aspect is the naturality that Brazilian society allowed the killing of Black poor people. So it's an absurd, and I reinforce this.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And I wanted to finish up with Philippe. So, facing this situation of kind of systematic corruption that you were identifying in your last response, what's the solution to this, or what strategies could be used to ameliorate these conditions?
So what makes the drug market so violent and so profitable is its illegality at the retail level. So decriminalizing it is the logical thing to do. And at the same time, it is important to emphasize that having cocaine extraordinarily strong and being hawked on every single corner as you walk by is not healthy for a community. Neither would it be to have someone be hawking cigarettes or hawking glassfuls of vodka on every other corner. So there needs to be a public health limitation of the supplies, but the prohibitionist repression of incarcerating the users and the low-level sellers and even the mid-level sellers is completely dysfunctional, and creates the violence. And it's the collateral negative effects of its illegality that make it so destructive, and actually, ironically, make it so profitable. So it's a true dysfunction of prohibitionism, and there's no ambiguity about the statistics. When you look at them historically, when you look at graphs, the more the U.S. invests in prohibition, the cheaper the drugs are, the more available they are, and the higher the potency. It's really mind-boggling. All this is well documented with DEA and hospital and laboratory data.
Thank you, Philippe. So now we're going to turn to questions asked by the audience. The first question comes from Sydney Silverstein, who thanks the panelists and asks about synthetic drugs in terms of non-pharmaceutical fentanyl and fentanyl analogs that have come to replace heroin in many areas, disrupting opium poppy cultivation. Has anyone on the panel heard through their research of disruptions to the cocaine trade due to the rise in synthetics?
No, I haven't come across. I don't think the Coca guys who I know would probably be necessarily aware of the fentanyl crisis in the States. Maybe.
So in Philadelphia, one thing that's happening is for the first time since the 1970s, the synthetic crystal methamphetamine is suddenly coming into the streets. formerly methamphetamine in most of the Northeast and in cities like Philadelphia was concentrated in specific sub-communities, in gay scenes, in clubs, and among among sex workers specializing for that market. So using both crystal methamphetamine and cocaine are stimulants, so they do compete with each other in that sense. What's interesting is that it hasn't decreased the cocaine sales in the local neighborhood. It's actually ironically enlarging them, because it's attracting now a new set of users who are attracted in for the methamphetamine, and then the sellers and the sellers then start using the cocaine, and also sometimes people want diversity and switch to cocaine for a little while. There isn't the physical addiction like there is with opiates, with stimulants. It's a massive psychological craving that you get with it. So there is an interesting dynamic there. The fentanyl dynamic is completely different, and that affects heroin.
Thank you, Philippe. I just wanted to put the question to Tanyeli. Have you noticed the presence of synthetics in Rio's shantytowns or in Sao Paulo? No.
No, so this is a new chapter here in Brazil, I imagine, because here opium is not so popular, and so synthetics are things for upper class, not the poor population. So I don't know. It's a new history here.
No, I understand. I was curious because in my work in Brazil, I've never run into synthetics, but you're more up to date with what's going on there than I am. Aaron Zach asks about the historical role of the FARC and other political insurgents as partners to cocaine traffickers in Colombia. I'll take this question myself since I do research in Colombia. Generally speaking, the FARC were historically interested in controlling territory prior to their demobilization and the peace process, and were very much focused on managing the coca growing process and the initial processing elements of it that Thomas was talking about in Bolivia. And that doesn't mean that there weren't other activities that they were involved in, but the primary activities were in managing peasant communities, and the coca leaf production and base paste production that took place there. And they, of course, had relationships with traffickers in terms of the sale and management of those markets. Eduardo Moncada also thanks the panelists and asks, the commodity chain framework is very compelling. Could the speakers comment on the different aspects of the commodity chain, how the commodity chain impacts trust in the communities within their field sites? Thomas?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Just to follow up on the question by Sydney, I was just thinking that changes in the US market towards fentanyl will take a really long time to be felt all the way down at the level of production, because even at the moment, cocaine production in South America is many times the amount of cocaine that is actually consumed. So I guess it would take a long time for it to actually have a meaningful impact on people who grow coca leaf. That was just a thought on that. So how does the commodity chain impact on trust? Well, so I suppose, yeah, it's the thing that I was sort of talk about a lot in my paper is exactly about that issue of trust. Is like, and throughout the entire book, actually, each of the volumes kind of is like, well, how is trust and cooperation built and maintained at each different stage of the trade? And in my particular case, it's really interesting because it's a very sort of widespread participation, first of all. So it's not like one sort of different sort of set apart community that you have to work together and keep borders. And how trust is built and maintained in here is that is that the entire cocaine trade is really structured around this kind of peasant moral economy, the subsistence ethic, as James Scott would talk about, in terms of reciprocity and a commitment to community and redistributing resources so no one kind of gets ahead at the expense of anyone else. But the other really important aspect that I elaborate on in my chapter is how in this particular region, state presence historically was pretty much absent. So trade unions emerged, or peasant unions, and they basically became a parallel form of state. So if you're part of the union, you have trust, you cooperate, you get involved in these reciprocal exchange networks of production. And you exclude outsiders, but the insiders, it's a lot of people. I'll leave that there.
Daniele, did you want to comment on trust in the communities you work in?
I think it's trends are dynamic, because a part of these stories I tell, it was in 2000s, 2010, and now the ethnographies are shown a changing on the trust, on the regulation of the PCC, for example. People are conflicted with the regulations about the traffic, so it's not so safer as I was saying before. No, so it's very dynamic, and in Rio de Janeiro nowadays there is a discussion about the mix between traffic and militias and their ways of governing the cities. So traffic, for example, extortion people for bills, gas and gasoline and something like that, and militia, for example, selling drugs. So a lot of things in dynamic perspective, and this of course has consequence in the daily life and how people realize live inside the drug trade.
And Philippe, trust in the places where you work.
Just one thing very, very quickly. There's absolutely no contradiction between fentanyl and cocaine. They mix just as well as cocaine mixes with heroin, right? Fentanyl is a depressant, cocaine is a stimulant, and psychoactively, that's what someone who likes the mixture of those two. So in terms of trust, that's the whole dynamic of the levels of competition and violence that the trade imposes, and the appeal of a charismatic, drug boss. There's these incredible networks of what at first sight looks like irrational solidarity that occur, where someone is willing to, go to tremendous risk to defend their best friend, or to not even a best friend, defend one of their neighbors and acquaintances. So they form these reciprocal exchanges of violence because the police are dysfunctional at protecting interpersonal violence. They don't care about interpersonal violence. That's not what they're trying to do. They're not trying to make people safe in the neighborhood. They're trying to work as little as they have to. So as a result, people have to take matters into their own hand. And one of the logics it takes is a youth culture of building buddies of reciprocal supportive violence with one another. And that's depressing. And it raises levels of interpersonal violence. Even though it's impressively solidary, you hear these expressions of love and loyalty expressed among youth in the name of wielding violence on another neighbor.
Thank you, Philippe. Mark Klazuski asks about money laundering. Does anybody have anything to say about money laundering?
That's a great thing to emphasize. None of this could happen without money laundering, and that's that sucking sound that occurs from the extraordinary multi-billion-dollar economy that's going, right into all the biggest banks. And it would be so easy to stop that. It's mind-boggling that, I mean, it's just the classic, it's the classic grotesqueness of the power of corporate finance that's what should be repressed.
Yeah, just to follow up, while none of our contributors in the book directly address the kind of financial aspect of money laundering, there is one chapter in the book by Robert Gay which does talk at quite some length about how drugs profits are reinvested locally in the context of a trafficking network from the Brazilian border to Rio de Janeiro. So that's a really interesting aspect. But yeah, it's something that we've not been able to work on, but Desmond and I have spoken about potentially a future project relating to that issue.
And so one last question comes from Jonathan Alarcon at the Marx School, who asks about the 1980s era involvement of US intelligence agencies in the drug trade. And I wonder if anybody wanted to comment on that.
That's a great thing to bring up, because that's again the origin of the crack, the crack, crack overwhelming the United States. That's what specifically brought crack to Los Angeles, because those basically the U.S. was funding the Contras, the counterinsurgency, was trying to overthrow the Sandinistas, in Nicaragua, and because of their tremendous, human rights violations, restrictions had been placed on that. The CIA didn't like that, so it started subcontracting cocaine from Colombia and flying it in US planes. What's unbelievable about this, it was all documented by the US Congress. So there were the church hearings. There's hundreds, if not thousands of pages of excruciating detail of cocaine being transshipped on military bases in military airplanes. And this is not atypical with drugs. The Vietnam War, brought kilos and kilos and kilos of heroin from Southeast Asia into the United States as well. And counterinsurgency wars are always accompanied almost always accompanied by drugs. They have to be financed by something, and that's the easiest way to do it. And once you monopolize violence, you can do that profitably and efficiently. And then you've got airplanes flying, so you can throw, guns and coke. The drugs take up less space than the guns.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Philippe, Daniele, and Tom. Thank you not just for participating here, but also for participating with me and Tom in the book, the edited volume. And I wanted to thank the audience for their attendance and participation in the event. And I finally wanted to thank Diana Lazov, Jason Epstein, and Andrea Hundley, who run the technical side of this program and support all of our events at Marx. This is my last event for the year of 2021, and I wanted to thank them for all of their support over the last year with these events that I run. I don't know if there are other Marx events coming up before the end of the year, but if there are, keep an eye on your email and watch out for those. I'm sure they will be interesting. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.